believe that will all work out very well for everybody, China, Japan, the United States, and everybody in the region. As far as the currency devaluations, I've been complaining about that for a long time. And I believe that we will all eventually, and probably very much sooner than a lot of people understand or think, we will be all at a level playing field. Because that's the only way it's fair. That's the only way that you can fairly compete in trade and other things. And we will be on that field, and we will all be working very hard to do great for our country. But it has to be fair, and we will make it fair. I think the United States is going to be an even bigger player.
Because I agree wholeheartedly. For me, the inflection point came with the Xi state visit to Obama in 2015. It actually happened even before Trump, as much as we always like to blame President Trump. And you said it exactly right. It was promise fatigue. So I live in Silicon Valley. I work with a lot of American tech companies. I would say before 2015, all the questions we were getting is, what are we doing wrong? Why are we, specific American company, not succeeding? And what can we do to help the Chinese understand that we're on their side? Then before she went to Washington, there was a dinner in Seattle that I think maybe all of us were at. And several of you hosted. And several of our clients said, how can I avoid being in the picture with Xi? And from then on, it's really been, well, it's time for them to buck up and do what they need to do and give us market access and protection.
So in answer to Nick's question, which I don't think I need to pose, you agree implicitly with his premise that Trump is right to call out China, that this consensus was shifting before Trump was even nominated.
I do agree with that. I think the way he's going about it is all wrong.
Here of these predictions of bifurcation, first made by Eric Schmidt of Google, of Alphabet, of decoupling. Is that something that you expect will happen?
I think it's already happening, and it's a tectonic shift that won't shift back even if we get a trade deal. So you see it from toys to motherboards, which are the things that hold all the circuits that run in your computer. A third of American companies that were export-oriented have shifted production out of China in the last year. 90% of motherboards were created in China in 2017. Now it's 50% and dropping rapidly. And those are not small shifts. You got to find a new factory. Sometimes these are huge capital investments. You're finding new supply chains and transporting your goods around the world. So I think that doesn't shift back very quickly, no matter what happens. And it's for a number of reasons, depending on the industry. So if you're in toys and apparel, you know, Chinese wages are going up. So you want to move to Vietnam and Malaysia. By the way, almost nothing is coming back to the US. Our own manufacturing has decreased a little bit in the past year, despite the trade war. So the big winners are the other Asian economies. And if you're in tech, you're worried about cyber espionage, which is a real issue. You're worried about tariffs. And so you have different reasons for moving your supply chain out, depending on who you are, but it's happening across the board. From Chinese reformers, many of us here spend a lot of time there, that Xi Jinping isn't listening to them, just like President Trump isn't really listening to some of his advisors. That makes this very difficult.
But
so
in the financial service,
do you think
it's good
that's going to be true for technology too?
I think technology is a different issue.
And
because it touches on national
security. It's a massive issue, right?
It's a massive issue.
We are taught.
Here's the problem when you talk about decoupling in tech. It's one global web of innovation, right? So semiconductors are often designed right here in the US, manufactured in South Korea, Taiwan, elsewhere, assembled into all of the devices in your pockets in China, and then sent back here. Right? Google has AI labs in the US, in China, in Europe, all over the place. Same with Alibaba, same with Baidu. So the idea that you can just neatly say, this is the 1960s in the Soviet Union, and I do think a little bit, and I would talk to the Washingtonians in the room, the East Coast sees this a little bit like, well, we just need better export controls, and we need CFIUS to be tougher, and we've done that, and there was some reform that was needed, When I see the export control regulations that are coming out now, I worry that they vastly overreach and they will harm our own companies' ability to innovate as much as they harm China's. So the idea that you're going to just break up the global web of innovation doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because the Chinese will then just innovate with the Europeans. Or Google will put its AI lab in Brussels and you'll have the Chinese engineers there. So that to me sounds really hard. What I think we need to be focused on, and Sue said this a little bit in the last panel, so far we've been all on the defensive. How do we build a moat around our technology and protect it? It's time to work on the offensive positive, and we are good at this. I would start with, after World War II, we created the international system that has served us enormously well on trade, but also on technology, on the IAEA, on all sorts of other things. It's time to make another such effort to set the norms for tech, which no one is doing right now. We need 5, 10 countries to get together and say, here's what we're going to say about AI and privacy. Here's how we're going to set the norms for cyber war. Here's how we're going to think about those things. Those efforts are non-existent. Some academics talk about them behind the scenes, but there isn't really a whole of community effort to do it, and we need it. Sue talked about, just one more point, sure. Sue talked about STEM education. Well, on the OECD PISA rankings, China ranks 10th in science and math education in the world, and we rank a measly 31st. That's pathetic. We can't compete if our kids can't do math. So there are all sorts of things that we can do domestically. China spends a lot more on government R&D than we do. And I have to say, and I say this to all my friends in Silicon Valley, you know, in China, everything that's developed in a private sector lab ultimately finds its way back to the government, the Communist Party, and the PLA. Not here. Project Maven, we couldn't even cooperate between the Defense Department and Google on a very basic AI project. So to an extent, I would say to my friends in Silicon Valley, we have to become patriots again instead of
And yet Google, as Peter Thiel pointed out the other day, is cooperating with China on this project Dragonfly, censored search engine.
My understanding was it was canceled, though.
But it was cancelled because of its employee, right? Well, both were, right? Maven and. So Tom, those are some very good suggestions from Anja. Anja, a specific question about how he's handling the short-term negotiations. Huawei was first of all banned,
yes.
And now Huawei's in the mix. If he can get some 20th century trade concessions, isn't that precisely the wrong way around?
Yes.
Isn't the Chinese?
It is precisely the wrong way around.
Trade deficits don't really matter that much, right?
But that would be my view and most economists' views. Look, honestly, I'm not privy into the private discussions of USTR. From what I've heard is that all of the right issues are on the table. The last panel put it very clearly. It's going to be very difficult for China to give in on the hardest issues, and those are fundamentally how they support their state-owned enterprises. Very, very difficult to change the whole character. On
Huawei.
on Huawei.
As a tactical
yes,
negotiation.
we have the duel of the executive orders right now.
Yeah.
And to me, it makes no sense at all. So Huawei, I would say, is a real threat in 5G. So you can just imagine you wouldn't want any company, Chinese or otherwise, having all of the infrastructure that controls not just the cell phones that you're all carrying, but the entire Internet of Things. And as one CEO recently put it to me, well, I guess that gives them the ability to shut down our electric grid or make all the self-driving cars drive off the road. Okay? So maybe that's a little excessive, but the 5G piece is really important. Not allowing Huawei to have access to our semiconductors, harder case, really hard for our semiconductor companies. Not allowing Huawei to have access to Android, really? Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so of course now you have an equal reaction in China, where they created in late May an unreliable entities list, very vague, very threatening. No companies have been listed. Many American companies live in fears that they'll be first on the unreliable entity list and they'll essentially be out. So it's no way to run a trade war.
So I mean, all three of you, well, Steve, I'd like you to.
I just don't want to be on the record as in any way, shape, or form thinking that the president's calling out China on the bilateral trade deficit makes any sense whatsoever. It's a violation of Economics 101. Anybody who thinks bilateral trade deficits matter doesn't understand any economics. In fact,
And from a business community point of view, I think we need to have a deep understanding of where these challenges are.
I agree. I think the mood music is very negative, and I've been surprised at how quickly we flip the switch from let's manage this relationship to it's all negative and conversation about a no Cold War. This requires a whole lot of nuance. And at the best of times, our government is terrible at that. We're the country of John Wayne. We see good guys and bad guys, and suddenly China has become the bad guy. I see this at Stanford, right? We have the FBI visiting us and telling us basically, beware of your Chinese students, they're all spies. Well, it is certainly true that some Chinese students in the US are being encouraged to spy, and some have, but it's a minority. So you have to actually deal with the problem which is real without resorting to xenophobia, which we're in grave danger of doing, and it's terrifying. And this is on all number of fronts. Manufacturing a good chunk of this conflict, and both sides, I think, are equally responsible. You hear it with the nationalism from Xi and his senior folks. You hear it from Trump. It is not inevitable that this becomes a new crisis. Not at all. No, 40% of the world's middle class will reside in China by 2030, 2035. So if we want our companies to thrive, at some level, we're going to have to be doing some business with them. The Obama administration did a fantastic thing when they brought China into the Paris Accords at the end of 2014. By the way, China's still in, and we're not. There are so many areas of overlap of interests. This isn't at all a situation like the US and the Soviet Union where there was very little overlap of interests. And by the way, dividing the world into blocks where China leads one and the US leads another one looks very ugly. Because if we force, I hear this all the time when I'm in Southeast Asia, everyone says, please don't force us to choose sides, because you'd be surprised how many people will choose the Chinese side. So let's hope it's still avoidable. I'll take it to start with. This is such a difficult issue because as the US government, we are woefully underprepared to deal with modern technologies. We don't really have people embedded in each ministry that understands it. We regulate iteratively, so we say, okay, we're here, slap a regulation on it, but then technology develops really rapidly, and we're not nimble enough to take that into account. And it's very different when you're talking about AI versus bio and CRISPR and everything that's coming down, and different technologies need different solutions. On AI, I could imagine one way to do it. Amy Webb, who's a computer scientist and scholar here, has called for something, she calls it a tech NATO. I wouldn't call it that, but basically a group of 10 countries that would get together as national countries, not under auspices of the UN, and say, okay, we're democracies, here's kind of what we think the broad guidelines are. Here's how you don't infringe privacy. Here's how you handle data appropriately. Here's what you do. China probably wouldn't be one of those 10 initially, but you wouldn't exclude them. You would say, look, here's the bar, please rise to meet it. And that's what we've done with a lot of other international accords. They're never perfect, they're always broken in some sense, but that's how you could start. And you could have something like that on every different technology. But we're nowhere near that. That's wishful thinking. On the tech sector, I don't see a lot of new opportunities. Most people are retrenching. In finance, as Steve already said, a lot of new opportunities. And by the way, also with Belt and Road, increasingly you see our financial institutions saying, well, maybe we could fund this road and this railroad. That seems like a dangerous proposition to me, but they're thinking about it. On Belt and Road, I agree with Tom. I haven't heard, just the US companies I deal with aren't so engaged in it. And I would say just in general, our analysis in the US is always lagging behind a little bit. So we're a little slow to realize how big this issue is and that China is really doing this on a massive scale, and it could have consequences in how beholden third world countries are to China. But now everyone's talking about Belt and Road and how dangerous it is. And I think in its structure, it sows the seeds of its own destruction in a way. So when I now go to South Africa, which was early on Belt and Road, they say, oh my God, we sold the store to China, we don't want to do that anymore. You talk to countries in South Asia and Central Asia, and they all say, oh my God, look at Sri Lanka and that white elephant port, we don't want to be them. And you see countries being more thoughtful about how they engage with China. Maybe I'll take this one.
Yeah.
You're right to raise the concern, and I think saying they're worried about it is an understatement. These laws are so broad that the Chinese government can interpret it any way they want. One of them is all technology sold into China has to be secure and controllable. What does that mean? Does that mean the Chinese government has access to all of your code, to some of your code? Can you prove that it's secure and controllable outside? Is there 100% censorship? The answer is yes. More and more you see these laws being used differently. I'm thinking of one example in particular where a US tech company has a JV in China, and every board meeting there are new requirements. It used to be, well, you can only own 49% in order to sell into any Chinese SOEs. Now you can only own 25%, so you got to sell more of your stake. So this is a really powerful lever by which the Chinese are controlling Western technology companies.
And what it's doing is